Okay, we are live and we are joined by Alexander Mercouris in London and the one and only Professor Jeffrey Sachs joining us as well. And we have about 30 minutes with Professor Jeffrey Sachs. I have all of Jeffrey Sachs' information in the description box down below, and I will add it as a pinned comment as well. I strongly suggest that everyone follows the work of Jeffrey Sachs, especially in these difficult and tough and very tense times. Alexander, let's just get right into the topics and let's go.
Absolutely. Well, I think the obvious topic is the collapse of diplomacy and where it's brought us. There's been a devastating article in Axios which say that they've never been contacted by more US officials in private, telling them how worried they are about the situation, that they sense that the situation is out of control, that the United States is facing multiple crises, that there's no clear way of solving these crises. And I was thinking about all of this. I was looking at the situation that we see in the Middle East today, and we are seeing why. Because I can see no real sign of diplomacy at all. The Russians are not speaking to the Americans. The Americans are having very difficult conversations with the Chinese. There's no real discussions between the Americans and the Iranians that we know about, and it doesn't seem as if we're seeing much of that happening either. We're seeing huge military buildups whose purpose is completely unclear, I suspect, to all of the parties, and there is no plan about how to get us out of this situation. And I'm going to say, Professor Sachs, I think this is exactly the kind of problem that you've been talking about in program after program that we've had with you. You pointed out how the United States doesn't talk, it doesn't properly listen, it tries to impose solutions, it resorts to military responses. And in a crisis like this, that is both inadequate and very dangerous.
You know, the amazing thing is how much diplomacy is taking place, just not with the United States. Actually, we're in a remarkable flurry of diplomacy. Russia and China, the BRICS countries, UN Security Council meetings going overtime, dozens of speakers yesterday at the open session of the UN Security Council. But the United States is not part of any of this diplomacy. The United States essentially absented itself from diplomacy many years ago when it thought, under tremendous delusions, that diplomacy was not needed because it was the indispensable country, the sole superpower, the country that all nations of the world look to. By the way, all the tropes repeated in that god-awful speech by Biden last week, showing how completely out of date he is, obviously, in many ways. So there's a lot of diplomacy. The world is shifting before our eyes in very dangerous ways, I might add, some positive in that voices are being heard that have not been heard for a very long time. But the U.S. basically, as you said, and I think is exactly right, the U.S. Leadership is non-existent, doesn't get it, and is so out of experience of diplomacy, they literally do not know who to talk to. And no one especially wants to talk to them. They want some cooperation from the U.S. The U.S. has stood alone now in the UN Security Council. This is very notable, actually, when you essentially have 14 countries aligned against one that exercises a veto. That also, from a foreign policy and diplomatic point of view, doesn't stand. And Israel is, of course, in an absolutely self-destructive mode right now. Not only doubling down on a horrendous and illegal action against civilians in Gaza, but dramatically raising the stakes. The Israeli government calling for the the Secretary General, who is doing a remarkable job in trying to help the world find a way through this, calling on the Secretary General to resign. It's unbelievable how Israel is saying, we'll go against the world, thinking as Netanyahu has, well, the United States has our back, but the U.S. has nobody's back anymore. And all of this, therefore, is one miscalculation built on the next.
I have to say, I completely agree. I think the decision to call for the UN Secretary General's resignation was a serious mistake. Criticize him, by all means. Criticism is fine. But to actually call for his resignation after he made some very some statements about, observing international humanitarian law and not committing war crimes and trying to put some kind of historical context into all of this, I thought that was most extreme. Now, I have to say, I think that Israel's policy becomes understandable given what you said about the fact that the Israelis have been led to believe for many, many years that they have America at their back, that the Americans have, in effect, brought Israel to this point. I'm not acquitting the Israelis of any mistakes that they themselves have made, but if you're constantly supported in whatever you do by the world's most powerful country, eventually your own diplomatic skills start to atrophy because you don't need diplomatic skills anymore, or at least that is what you start to think. And I get the sense that the Israelis themselves, seeing this situation, one of the reasons they're reacting in the way they are is because they themselves are beginning to become nervous. That is my own response to what happened in the Security Council yesterday.
Yeah, I think everybody is becoming nervous, but they have no alternative gears. They have no mechanism now. They have absolutely destroyed diplomacy over the years because of this idea, this basically false idea that the United States has propounded, that it will get its way and those backed by the United States will get their way. And this is of course, the deep link of the Ukraine crisis and the Israel-Palestine crisis. They both are the result of massive failures of diplomacy predicated on the same idea that you can, in the case of Ukraine, of course, the U.S. has our back. We will join NATO. What can Russia do? And in the case of Israel, we don't have to speak with the Palestinians for decades. Basically, everything is fine and quiet. And, we knew Jake Sullivan's remarkable demonstration of delusion in his statement a couple of weeks ago that the Middle East is quieter than it has been in decades. But when you get my issue of Foreign Affairs arrived in the mail yesterday, and I didn't realize it was in print. So the lead story of this central journal of American foreign policy has the Middle East is quieter than it has been for decades. In the pullout quote in the front article, you show we are absolutely like the cartoon character that has run off the cliff, didn't realize there was no ground below, is sitting in the air for one split moment, and then boom, and that is what we are experiencing right now before our eyes. And whether they have some adjustment is a little bit doubtful as well, because the president is too old for this. Obviously, is too unequipped mentally for this, from the point of view of his mindset built over decades. Netanyahu is as destructive and divisive as any leader of Israel has been, even before this crisis. And so there is no leadership. The United States, of course, doesn't even have a functioning Congress right now. Our government will be on the verge of another shutdown crisis within another couple of weeks. So this is a situation where there is no evident capacity to adjust to any of this by the U.S. But let me say again, what does impress me as a possibility is the rest of the world actually finding its feet in this because it is gathering diplomatically. China is proposing steps in the Middle East which are going to be listened to. China will chair the UN Security Council in the month of November. That will be a notable occasion for a worldwide consultation with or without the United States. So events are not completely desperate and hopeless, but they are extraordinarily dangerous. This is, to be sure, this is obvious.
Can I just ask quickly, Professor Sachs? We're hearing lots of reports about people within the US government becoming extremely worried. There was that article in the Financial Times that there's people in the State Department who are worried, that there's stories that staffers in Congress are getting worried too. Have you picked up any sign of this? Because these are all rumors that we're hearing off stage, but we've seen nobody actually come forward and propose alternatives or say anything that seems to break from the consensus at the moment.
It's very interesting. The short answer is no, but the reason is that foreign policy really has become a cabal. We've not had a debate in public about U.S. foreign policy throughout the entire Ukraine crisis because it's tightly held by the White House, the Pentagon, the intelligence agencies, and we know the very few top people involved. We don't hear from the diplomats more generally. We have basically heard from Biden, Blinken, Sullivan, Newland, and Lloyd Austin. Those are the faces of this. Congress did not debate any of these issues. Now Congress is completely dysfunctional. Interestingly, as you know, the American public opinion was moving rather strongly against Biden's Ukraine policy, but it's amazing how the policies towards the Middle East have also undergone a massive sea change. We're seeing a break of U.S. support for Israel. We're seeing a generational change that's quite dramatic. Young people are basically utterly divided on this. The campuses in the United States are utterly divided in this. What we also understand very clearly is that all of this caught the Washington leaders, if you can use a term that sounds almost like an oxymoron in this, because there are no leaders, but unaware of the world, seeing the changing understanding in the world. Jake Sullivan's quotation is not only a huge embarrassment and a reflection of a complete unawareness of ground reality, but is a measure of how the U.S. Leaders talk themselves into a view that they don't have to talk to anybody to gauge anything. So all of this is that we don't hear anything more than what we glean. I don't hear anything more from what we glean in these tidbits, but I think that that's because there are not deep processes of debate and reflection. There is a collapse of an approach before our eyes and not really an alternative process in play. And Biden is not the kind of he doesn't have the capacity of a John F. Kennedy to convene leaders and think through a deep crisis like this. They just don't even exist anywhere in Washington right now.
Can you discuss the United Nations? Because it seems to me that one of the most interesting things about this crisis is that it is beginning to center increasingly on the United Nations. Lula and Putin spoke the day before yesterday, and they're coordinating positions on the Security Council. Putin and Erdogan spoke yesterday, and they're again coordinating positions on the Security Council. The Chinese spoke to both, the Chinese foreign minister called and spoke to both the foreign ministers of Israel and Palestine. Again, you're absolutely correct. Lots of diplomatic activity going on, and it is centered on the security, on the United Nations. I very much get the impression that the United States government doesn't take the UN as seriously as it should, and doesn't realize that this is where opinion is going to crystallize, and that it really does risk being outmaneuvered in the United Nations.
This is exactly right. One of the essential points of this U.S. arrogance over the last 30 years was the very clear determination of the United States not to let the nuisance of the United Nations get in the way of U.S. policy at any moment. And that has been true of this administration as well as past administrations. But the rest of the world is seeing the essential role of the institutions of the United Nations, the UN Security Council, and I will say the General Assembly, because as you've been pointing out many times, the General Assembly is going to find its voice on this crisis. There is a process uniting for peace, actually due to Dean Acheson, the Secretary of State and senior poobah of American foreign policy in the Truman era and Kennedy era, which was a doctrine for very different purposes, but it said if there's a complete bottleneck or gridlock or veto in the UN Security Council that blocks action, events will move to the UN General Assembly. This is, I think, likely to happen here unless the United States finally realizes that the path that it's on is a complete dead end for everybody, and including for the U.S. to have any role and say, meaning that if the U.S. continues to veto action in the Security Council, it will go to the General Assembly, and we'll find that the world is deeply aligned for peace, for a ceasefire, for a solution to the Palestinian crisis, that is statehood for Palestine. And this will be also a geopolitical earthquake, actually, because I think that the clear shifting lines of the world will become even more clear in ways that are being exposed by the Ukraine and Israel-Palestine crisis right now, but are going to become even more vivid. By the way, if we survive this without terrible devastation, there is a lot of good that can come from this because it is possible to see a multipolar world not only de facto in place, but also de jure in the sense of under the UN Charter and under international law, actually a clear change to a world in which the voice of the world will be heard and determinative in ways that it has not been during this illusory unipolar period of the United States. So maybe we're actually moving to something where global rule of law could actually take shape. But I think, not so sorry to be long-winded on all of this, but the point is that this is a crisis that has not led to people saying, oh, why do we care about the UN? How useless? Quite the contrary. What we're seeing is virtually all nations of the world, other than the US and Israel, coming forward and saying we need solutions that abide by the UN Charter and that are under the responsibility of the UN Security Council. So it has not been the abandonment of international law, but an increased recognition that that's exactly what we need. And because China is very much in that direction, and Russia is seeking this also, and Russian diplomacy put forward the first attempt at a ceasefire, and this was an extremely constructive move. I think that there is really a move with Brazil also very important in its own right, very important because of President Lula's leadership, but also the next president of the G20, where the key underlying economic decisions are going to be taken that will be the fallout of all of these events. This is a changing world before our eyes.
I completely agree. I think one of the things that I've noticed also is that you're seeing all of these comments made around the world, including by ASEAN. This has not been noticed, but they're to some extent perhaps more detached from this, but they've made some very clear statements. And they are talking about international law and the United Nations. They are not talking about this rules-based international order that people in the West talk about. That seems to be of no interest to them at all. It is international law as classically understood, centered on the United Nations, based on the Charter of the United Nations, that countries outside the West are converging around. What do you make of all of these enormous military buildups? Because I think that my own view about this is that this has been excessive and hugely unwise and has added to the tension, and nobody knows exactly what its purpose is. I mean, does the United States itself fully understand the extent to which these huge military deployments have made the situation in the Middle East even more tense and even more dangerous than it might otherwise have been?
Well, when we say the United States, of course, again, we have to think specifically about the personalities involved. And the answer is the leadership is extraordinarily weak. The president is extraordinarily weak in all of this, aged, out of date, with a wrong approach to foreign policy from the day he stepped into office, a promoter of the neoconservative U.S. leadership, indispensable nation ideas for decades. So in this sense, I think the risks of miscalculation are absolutely profound. And I'm sorry to say it, this is a trite point, but an absolutely true one. The possibilities of terrible accidents are extremely grave. We know that American troops are being shot at right now, and we don't know the truth about this, but the war is already spreading right now. We know that there have been attacks in Syria and in Iraq. We don't know, I don't know at least the details of this at all. There is a tremendous amount of violence, a tremendous amount of hotheads. Netanyahu is certainly one of the most irresponsible politicians on the world scene and has been for a long time. He profoundly divided his own country, which is absolutely spiraling into a deeper and deeper crisis. We have statements that are intemperate, doesn't even begin to describe the vulgarity of statements coming out of some of the Israeli hardliners right now. And in these circumstances, terrible things can happen. That's why the leadership of the UN Secretary General right now is so important, and I think has been remarkable, I must add, and why calm voices from the Chinese leaders is very much appreciated, from Lula, from others. This is needed to help stabilize what is truly an explosive brew right now. And in terms of whether the American leaders understand this, clearly they don't. They're scrambling like mad. They are operating on premises that are completely wrong. And it would take a lot of learning in a short period of time. And bureaucracies also don't learn much. Leaders can make an individual difference, but it would be surprising to me for Biden to rise to the occasion, frankly.
I'm going to speak briefly about other countries. I think I have been very impressed again by the sophistication Brazil is bringing to bear in this crisis, and I have to say I'm deeply dismayed by the fact that Europe is nowhere to be seen. I mean, we are not doing anything remotely useful or constructive in this crisis at all. That I can see there's divisions, and there's arguments about the behavior of the president of the European Commission and the role that she has played. But no European government of importance seems to be rising to this situation or acting to calm things. So we see Brazil, which has not been active in diplomacy in the past, is now playing a positive and creative role. And Europe, where diplomacy was born, modern diplomacy was born, is just absented itself entirely.
It's completely stunning. Of course, van der Leyen long ago mortgaged the European Commission to NATO, and maybe even to her personal quest to become the next Secretary General of NATO, though that's a footnote of no special significance. But she has been terrible during this Ukraine crisis, and now completely lost in the current events. Europe itself, of course, is very, and not to say Germany, of course, probably the weakest and most misguided and often loudmouthed foreign ministers that we have, and Germany inherently, because of history, can't really do anything constructive on this. France, whoa, just strangeness coming out of Macron's words. I mean, absolutely bizarre from one day to the next. So no clarity. Of course, France has its own multiple crises and is overwhelmed in its Africa sphere and so forth. So France out of this. Actually, we've heard some sensible words from Prime Minister Meloni in Italy. I was when she attended the forum in Cairo, and that was good to hear. We've heard some sensible things coming from the Spanish government, but this is not a government that it's not even in place right now after elections and still trying to form a coalition. Not a place where one can forge any kind of European leadership. Northern Europe, just so completely overwhelmed, I suppose, with Ukraine and with their own crises, not a peep. So Europe plays no guiding role at all. And of course, Europe has a very substantial Muslim population, which is out on the streets protesting, which means that Europe falling in line with, if you could say U.S. policy, there is no policy, but falling in line with the United States doesn't work at all. So Europe is adrift in this from a diplomatic point of view. Diplomacy has been awful during the whole Ukraine crisis, but it is even more awful and inconsequential now. But I would say one thing: Europe will not block in the UN Security Council or in the UN General Assembly clarity right now to push for a political solution. So Europe will not align automatically with the US, whatever the US leadership decides to do. Europe cannot and will not follow lockstep in that, because perhaps unlike the Ukraine crisis, this isn't in the same way a security threat where the U.S. has to hide underneath the U.S. Umbrella, nuclear umbrella, but rather a case where Europe's own internal politics are so much at stake in the Middle East that somebody in Europe's going to have to think about Europe's interests. Netanyahu really needs to go. He is a walking disaster who needs to leave the scene. I think there's no doubt that this is crimes against humanity, war crimes every day. Challenges that we face, say the war in Ukraine or this war in Israel and Palestine, these are easily solvable problems. This is not quantum mechanics. This is pretty straightforward.
Grüezi miteinander, ganz herzlich willkommen und einen wunderschönen guten Tag, meine sehr verehrten Damen und Herren, liebe Freunde. Ich begrüße Sie zu dieser Sondersendung von Weltwoche Daily, die andere Sicht, unabhängig, kritisch, zuversichtlich am Mittwoch, dem 1. November 2023. Und ich bin sehr froh und dankbar, dass wir als Gast in unserer Sendung haben einen Vertrauten, einen Autor der Weltwoche und auch schon Interviewgast unseres Programms. Es ist, und ich werde jetzt auf Englisch wechseln, it's the great privilege to have you on the show, on the program, Professor Jeffrey Sachs.
Thank you.
From Columbia University. Thank you very much. It's highly appreciated that we can take your precious time for insights into world politics.
I'm delighted to be with you, let me say. It's a privilege for me.
Great, thank you very much. I just made an interview with Colonel McGregor a few days ago, and he drew a gloomy picture of this war in the Middle East. He says that one should protect Israel from itself. It could be that Prime Minister Netanyahu is bombing Israel into the abyss. I mean, this was the metaphor. This was the description he used. What do you make of that? How do you see this war of Israel now against the Palestinians? Can it succeed, or is it self-destructible?
I think it is self-destructive, or I should say Bibi destructive. Bibi Netanyahu is absolutely divisive element in Israel. He had already brutally divided Israeli society before the October 7 Hamas terrorist attack. He obviously led a government that completely let Israel's guard down in terms of basic border security and intelligence processing. He should resign. He has no business doing what he's doing, but he's desperately trying to somehow save his political life by going to war that is going to be completely terrible for Israel. There's no way that Israel wins its deeper objectives from this war. It's killing thousands of innocent people, especially women and children in Gaza. This brutality and carnage is in front of the whole world. People are aghast, as they should be. This needs to stop. Netanyahu really needs to go, but Israel has different ways to approach this. It's not even trying diplomatically. It's just saying, well, we're going to go to war. Netanyahu said this is the time of war. He's wrong. He is a walking disaster who needs to leave the scene.
Well, Prime Minister Netanyahu is not here in the program, so I'm his duty defender, or how do you call that in English? I try to bring in his probably his perspective, and I say, well, he's in a tragic situation. He's in a desperate situation. On the one hand, you have this massacre from October 7, I mean, a head of state, of government, he has to do something. You're confronted with a terror organization, so you try to rebuild in a way the security or the. I mean, you have to defend yourself. You have to attack your attacker. Is there not some argument that can be made? I mean, what should he have done? I mean, he cannot just sit back and wait. What do you say?
He should have resigned immediately. He's a disgrace. He failed. And what is one of the dark truths that is known to experts and should be known to the public is Netanyahu played with Hamas. He built Hamas. He supported Hamas. He gave Hamas the base in Gaza because he wanted to weaken the Palestinians in general, because he's been playing a game all along to avoid a Palestinian state. That's been his thing. And one of the things he decided to do was that if the Palestinian Authority represented both the West Bank and Gaza, it would become too strong. So he bolstered Hamas, and you can read about this everywhere now. This is even told by his own political associates. So no, he should not have sat back. He should leave the scene. Now, I know you're playing his personality. I would never be so rude to you, but if he were sitting in front of me, that's what I would tell him. Go. You failed. You have divided the country. You have prevented a political solution. The world, rightly, and most Israelis, when they're not misled or terrified, have long called for a political settlement with the Palestinians. And you, Mr. Netanyahu, have blocked that all along. You actually bolstered Hamas. You fell asleep at the switch. You did not even protect Israel with basic security at the border on October 7th. So just go. That's what I would tell him.
I mean, this is an absolute surprise that Israel, with its army and all these guards and these walls and these surveillance systems, could have been so much duped. I mean, surprised by Hamas. What do you make of that? How is that possible? How do you explain that?
They are arrogant. They believe that by using force, by imposing an apartheid state, they can make things quiet, and it doesn't work. And when you listen to people on the ground who know year after year, they will tell you the situation is seething. You know, the human rights groups have called Gaza the world's largest open air prison, not by accident. The human rights groups have called Israeli occupation of Palestine an apartheid state. These are not the words from me. These are the words from groups like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch. Now, the arrogance is both Israel's and its backer, the United States, which also has a view that diplomacy is for losers. We don't need diplomacy. We need military power. We don't have to talk to anybody. We don't have to negotiate with anybody. We don't have to settle with anybody. We just need to impose solutions. Now, this is false. And there have been so many warnings that this is false. But if you ask me what led to this failure, it wasn't a technical failure. It was an attitudinal failure. It was arrogance. And it was arrogance also of the U.S. After all, our national security advisor, Jake Sullivan, wrote an article, which he wrote before October 7, but it came in my mailbox in Foreign Affairs, the last issue of 2023. And what is the pullout quote from that article? The Middle East is quieter than it has been in 20 years. That's our national security advisor. And he says in this article that the solutions in Gaza have really quieted down. Well, that shows a detachment from ground reality. So the Israelis and the Americans talk to each other. They don't talk to anyone else in the world, really. And then they get the idea that all is safe and a disaster hits. By the way, it's not unlike 9/11. 9/11 was a catastrophic failure of the American Homeland Security. Not just that it was a terrible event, but there were signs. They were told that groups were training to use planes to attack buildings. This was specific information. And so this is the same story. What did Bush do afterwards? Well, he became a great hero for a moment, because he said, we're going to retaliate. There was never an honest moment. What did you guys do? How did you blow this so terribly? And we have a presidential system in the United States. We're stuck with that. It wasn't bad in 1787, a 4-year term, but a prime minister can leave from morning till afternoon, and it's time for Netanyahu just to leave.
How severe is the human rights situation or the human suffering now at Gaza? I've read it's about 8,000 dead so far. Have you, from the UN, have you any specific numbers? Also, children, civilians affected here?
I'm only reading the public information, so I have no inside information. But the information's coming from all sources, from, of course, the Gaza health authorities, who are authoritative, from Doctors Without Borders, Médecins Sans Frontières, from the United Nations. And we just had a resignation of a senior UN official who said that this is essentially almost, I don't know what word he used, whether he said genocide or something terrible, but he resigned saying the world's just standing by as these horrific events are taking place. So I think there's no doubt that this is crimes against humanity, war crimes every day, absolutely untenable, and all put forward as if there is no alternative. This is the biggest problem. Now, why? Of course, there are alternatives. There are other ways to make security. There are other ways to actually solve the politics. But the idea of Israel and the United States is never to look below the surface at the underlying political issues, because that might require concessions to the other side. For example, the establishment of a state of Palestine, which the U.S. mouths as its objective. In fact, every day says it right now, because the U.S. has signed all these UN Security Council resolutions. But tell me, has Bibi Netanyahu said a word about that? Don't bet on it for your life, because, of course, he opposes every possible diplomatic way out of this. And so to say that the only alternative is to kill thousands or tens of thousands of innocent people is basically to hide two things. One, the personal failure of Netanyahu and his cabinet, and second, to hide the political solution, which these hardliners don't want us to even think about, but is the only way to make peace. And in the context of a political solution, you can demobilize, you can disarm groups because you have a political settlement. And that is what is needed here.
So you're saying that militarily it's impossible to beat a terrorist group like Hamas, which is now hidden also in bunkers. I mean, as far as I know, they're using also civilian facilities in order to have their supplies there, some weapons and even headquarters. So if I understand you correctly, there is no military solution against this sort of enemy.
Of course, I'm not a military expert, but what I would say is that if there is a military solution, it would involve the deaths also of tens of thousands of innocent people. So it would constitute war crimes and crimes against humanity. There is no military solution that does not involve crimes against humanity. And that's the problem. In other words, it's not whether Israel could bomb Gaza to smithereens. It probably could. But could it do it in a way which is consistent with any kind of legitimacy, moral, practical, political legitimacy of Israel going forward? No, that can't be done. So yes, it may be possible to defeat Hamas. I'm not sure. But it is not possible to do this in a civilized, law-abiding way. And so Israel needs to think before it severs relations with the rest of the world, the world's nations.
Mm-hmm. The influential Wall Street Journal argued that if you are waging war against this kind of guerrilla type terrorist enemy, it's inevitable that you have civilian casualties. And everybody who says you should have no civilian casualties is, in other words, denying the right to self-defense to Israel. What are you making of this argument in the Wall Street Journal?
The Wall Street Journal is the leading voice of the U.S. Wealthy establishment. So what I make of it is that this is the standard and expected expression of the most self-entitled and powerful group in the world. It is essentially the might makes right approach. Nobody has to answer to the international community, to international law, to standards of humanity. So I make of it what I've made of the Wall Street Journal for the last 68 years. It speaks the voice of very powerful people who do not believe that they are bound by rules of morality and decency and international law, I'm afraid. But this is exactly America at its power structure. This is what I basically bemoan every day. It is the arrogance that has gotten the United States into perpetual wars. It's the arrogance that has led countries that are supported by the United States to believe that they don't need diplomacy either. It's the same arrogance that has led Ukraine nearly to complete destruction by now, not at Putin's hands in the sense that people think, but by the failure to negotiate at all. Mm-hmm. Because they voted a law, no negotiation. Now, why would they vote a law, no negotiation? Because the United States told them to. And what does the Wall Street Journal represent? It represents precisely, clearly, explicitly the power structure of the elite of the United States. So what the Wall Street Journal said, frankly, I could have predicted before they wrote it.
It is striking, and a lot of people I talk to seem to notice that. They see that with the war in the Ukraine, the so-called West was very keen on denouncing any breach of international law. They were even putting an indictment against President Putin before the criminal court in Den Haag. And now, if there are other possible crimes, one can say, against civilian populations, the West and the American and also the European authorities, they don't say nothing. Do you see, I mean, it's obvious that they have double standards here. How dangerous is that? I mean, I was just thinking, I mean, the international law, which is some kind of benchmark or hallmark of something, an ideal we should strive to preserve, but with these double standards in the eyes of many, many people, of millions of people on the planet, what's happening with international law right now?
You know, the United States made a good start, a brilliant start in 1945, championing the formation of the United Nations to pick up the remnants of the League of Nations, which had not joined in the previous generation. And the United States, in the very person of Eleanor Roosevelt, the First Lady of the United States, wife of Franklin Roosevelt, our greatest president, the one who brought the United Nations, oversaw the formation and the promulgation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. But the United States took a fateful turn in 1947 with the National Security Act, which established the CIA and which put the U.S. On a path of secret wars, covert operations, a security state, and without rehashing all of the Cold War, let me just summarize. The U.S. led 64 covert regime change operations between 1947 and 1989. That means usually the CIA in the lead, overthrowing foreign governments right and left. International law has never played much of a role for the United States since 1947. And my whole life, I'm born in 1954, the United States has been overthrowing governments right and left, by the way. And since I'm an international specialist, I've seen a lot of this close up. The idea that the U.S. abides by international law is, of course, silly. It's not even a school child should have that idea. When the United States gets its way at the UN, it says, okay, good. When the U.S. doesn't get its way at the UN, it says, okay, who cares? And this is basically the prerogative of one country in the world, the only country that has 800 military bases around the world in 80 countries. So, no, the U.S. does not take seriously international law, has not since 1947. And it's a shame. It's a little bit like Rome keeping the trappings of the Republic, but slipping into empire. Well, the United States in 1947 slipped into empire. We still have the trappings of Congress and so forth. We even have the trappings of a president, because you shouldn't take too seriously what the president does. They're not in charge necessarily either on these issues. We have a permanent war machine, always revving. We have CIA all over Ukraine. Come on, this is the real world, not the rhetoric of international law, which is left to the other 192 countries of the UN, many of which would really like international law, by the way. They don't have the power of the United States. So they say better to live under law than just under whatever the United States deems it are the rules of the day. So the short answer is hypocrisy is not an exception. It is the rule. But it's the rule, it's the prerogative of the most powerful in their mind. This is why it so much comes down to arrogance repeatedly. And the basis of arrogance is to forget the most fundamental adage of life, and that what goes around comes around. If you behave this way, well, times are going to change and you're going to suffer the consequences. We once had somebody named Jesus who said that the most important law of all was do to others what you would have them do to you. Confucius said the same thing. In other words, there should be a principle that applies to everybody. That's the basic idea. Immanuel Kant said the same thing at the end of the 18th century. Mm-hmm. And the United States has been so arrogant for so long it doesn't believe it. And then countries like Israel, which have very also particular histories, and one should never underestimate what the Holocaust has meant for shaping the mindset and understanding of the world among Israeli leaders. Israel has believed we have the U.S. at our back, and so international law, not so much. And this is the tragic reality, because we really need international law in an international world if we're not going to be at war all the time.
We see growing anger in the Islamic world, in the Muslim world. We have seen this speech by Turkey's President Erdogan, which was very confrontative, was very aggressive. You see other voices. You see growing anger. Do you think that this whole war and the way how Israel wages this war could turn this whole thing into a worldwide mess, in some kind of global confrontation, even into a third world war?
Again, we should never underestimate how one damn thing can lead to the next. And that's why crises need to be solved, not just smirked at. A couple of gunshots by some kids in Sarajevo in 1914 set off World War I, which we're not out of yet because we're still living with the consequences of that war exactly in Israel and Palestine, by the way. And that was one damn thing leading to the next, to mobilization, to threats, to this and that, and suddenly war in August 1914. And we're on the verge of that right now. The arrogance of Israel in this, or rage or desperation, or however you want to characterize the emotions of it, the complete failure of Europe to have a coherent thought in its head, I must say, on this. Europe all abstaining from a UN Security Council, a UN General Assembly resolution calling for what? For a humanitarian ceasefire. Europe can't even figure that out anymore, is how bad things are in Europe. Of course, I'm exaggerating a tiny bit because France and Spain voted in favor of the humanitarian ceasefire, but most of the European
Switzerland
Union.
too.
Yeah. Oh, did. I didn't realize that. That's good. But Europe cannot figure out dozens of countries to have a humanitarian ceasefire. It's unbelievable. The United States, I understand. I don't agree with, I don't approve, but at least I understand. Europe, I don't understand how it cannot find a coherent idea, whether it's about Ukraine or whether it's about Palestine and Israel, because Europe sold its foreign policy soul to the United States, for heaven's sake. There's no thought in Europe about normalcy right now, about diplomacy. And this is really a terrible problem. So the answer is yes, things can easily get out of hand because we already have shelling coming from Yemen. Okay, maybe Hezbollah, maybe the United States, some troops will be hit. Then the United States will go bomb Iranians someplace, and then the war will escalate. And I cannot stress to you enough how stupid some of American politicians are. If you want names, start with Lindsey Graham, who immediately called for a war with Iran. These people just absolutely want to egg us on to self-destruction, because to know them is to understand this, not a coherent, rational idea in their heads.
In this week's Weltwoche edition, we have the privilege to publish your most recent piece on this conflict. The English title is, if I get it correctly here, I got the German translation, Turning Carnage into Peace.
Yes.
This is a very concrete, a very specific path you are depicting here, you're showing here, from this carnage, as you say, to peace. Could you give us the landmarks, the milestones of the path to peace now in this difficult situation?
Thank you. Thanks for publishing it also. Well, it starts really with von Clausewitz, the German war theorist after Napoleon, who made the most perceptive observation about war of modern times, which is that war is the continuation of politics with other means. When you see a war, think politics. In other words, what is the underlying political driver of this violence, and then address it. And the underlying driver of this violence is the need to implement a Palestinian state as a member of the United Nations and with control over the Islamic holy sites of East Jerusalem and with the capital in East Jerusalem. Now, that's not some great insight. That is the content of UN resolution after resolution for decades. And the UN General Assembly resolution that just passed with a vote of 140 yes to 14 against said the same thing, a two-state solution. So Netanyahu blocks this. He's got to go anyway because of the disaster that he oversaw. But an Israeli government needs to recognize there is no peace, there is no way out of this, there is no security, there is no solution without a two-state solution. And the rest of the world needs to be very clear that this is the only way. It's been on the books as international law for decades. The United States has reiterated its commitment to this. Make this the centerpiece of peace right now. So the first thing I call for is the Israeli government, presumably led by a new prime minister, which could happen within the next 5 minutes in the right way, to say we are ready for a political settlement based on UN resolutions, both in the Security Council and in the General Assembly. And on that basis, the Arab League and, in fact, the world's nations and the UN Security Council commit to Israel's comprehensive security and to the disarmament and demobilization of these military jihadist groups, starting with Hamas and also the Islamic Jihad and others. Now, those groups are backed by Iran, among other countries. I deal a lot with Iranian diplomats. Iran is ready for normal diplomatic relations. In fact, Iran negotiated normal diplomatic relations with Europe and the United States, and the United States pulled out of the agreement. So all who say, oh, you can't negotiate with Iran, it's typical. That's the lie told by the powerful. The United States broke the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, negotiated solemnly by Europe and the United States and Iran, and then Trump pulled out of it. So Iran can be brought into this with the sanctions dropped against Iran, and with Iran a participant in the world and able to stop this nonstop U.S. attack against its diplomacy when Iran has shown it's ready to engage. Not only the JCPOA, Iran has just joined the BRICS countries. So China, Brazil, and others can help Iran to support this demilitarization and this demobilization. So this is the second part. We don't need a war in Gaza. We need a peace in order to stop the militarism. Of course, at the same time, Israel should not let its guard down on its border. This isn't a matter of trust. It never should have incurred October 7 if it was doing the normal job, not the heroism, just the normal job at the border. So in the meantime, I argue that Hamas is not some fundamental existential threat to Israel today or tomorrow. It isn't. In fact, it's trapped inside Gaza. So Israel needs to keep its border guard up, but to move to politics. And then on that basis, the UN Security Council should oversee the establishment of a sovereign Palestine that becomes the 194th member of the United Nations, and crucially is given its capital properly in East Jerusalem and control over the Islamic holy sites, which are extremely important because the Israelis keep abusing the Islamic holy sites. So rather than stoking religious war, we should have responsibility. And this is also possible. And then my last pillar of peace is to help fund normal economy and development. But first, stop destroying Gaza because it's going to be very expensive to rebuild. And just like I said, stop destroying Ukraine, and then talking about a $750 billion program to rebuild, much cheaper not to destroy it in the first place. But our dunderheads in our foreign policy in the United States, what passes for foreign policy, don't get it in any event. This is my basic point. A political solution, a demilitarization and demobilization, bringing Iran back in normal diplomatic relations, a sovereign Palestine with its capital in East Jerusalem and control over the Islamic holy sites, and a financial program to put the new state of Palestine on its feet.
Last quick point. We're talking always, we have to talk about very dark issues. There is a lot of darkness around us. A personal question to wrap it up. Where is your where is the silver lining? Where do you see the beam of light in this very dark world at the moment? What gives you reason for optimism?
You know, it's a very straightforward answer, which is the challenges that we face, say the war in Ukraine, which is a war caused by this stupidity of the US trying to enlarge NATO to Ukraine of all places, or this war in Israel and Palestine, which is a war over Israel's intransigence in a two-state solution and instead trying to impose an apartheid system. These are easily solvable problems. This is not quantum mechanics. This is not, deep cosmology. This is pretty straightforward. And so that's a great ray of hope. In fact, the other ray of hope is that almost the whole world says, yeah, of course, they get it. And so if you're not completely on some pay of the military-industrial complex, or desperately trying to get a job in the Biden administration or something, it's not too hard to see what the ways out are. So the happy point is these are not unsolvable problems. This is not the character of an asteroid coming towards us and we don't know how to handle it. This is completely solvable problems. So we should be happy about that. We should be optimistic about that. We should get to work to solve them.
Professor Sachs, Jeffrey, many thanks. Great privilege to have you in this program.
Real pleasure. Thanks so much.